Memphis, 1962. The Kings of Rhythm had a rule. One rule, really. Everything else, the set list, the tempo, the key, the length of every solo, those were just details. Details that changed night to night depending on the crowd, the room, the liquor in the air. But the rule never changed. On Ike Turner's stage, nobody shone brighter than Ike Turner. It wasn't written anywhere. It didn't need to be. Every musician who ever sat behind Ike understood it within the first rehearsal. You watched how he moved at the front of the stage. You watched how the spotlight followed him. You watched how he'd turn his head, just slightly, to find whoever had started to drift towards something interesting. A run that climbed a little too high, a chord voicing that pulled a few ears away from the front. And you watched the look he gave them. Not angry, just quiet. A reminder. A wall. Nobody argued with the wall. Ike had built something real in the years before 1962. He had a sound, a reputation, a machine that worked. The Kings of Rhythm were tight, professionals. They showed up on time, dressed right, played the charts, held it together through 3 sets in smoky rooms where the air was so thick you could almost chew it. When Ike brought in a new player, the first thing that happened was never about music. It was about watching. A new player watched for a week before they were trusted with anything. They learned the shape of the thing before they touched it. The young guitarist from Seattle didn't know any of this when he walked into the rehearsal room in late 1962. He was maybe 19, thin, wore a jacket that had seen better months. He'd been moving around the South for the better part of a year. A little work here, a few nights there, eating when there was something to eat and playing when there was somewhere to play. Someone had told him the Kings of Rhythm needed a rhythm guitarist. He'd shown up with his guitar in a case that didn't quite close all the way. His name was Jimi James. He said it quietly, like it was something he might need to take back. Ike looked at the case, looked at the boy, and told him to plug in. What happened in that rehearsal was unremarkable. That was the point. Jimi James played exactly what was asked of him. He kept the rhythm, hit the changes, stayed out of the way. He had good ears. That was clear. When a chord shifted unexpectedly, his hand was already moving. When Ike added a passing tone on the fly, Jimi caught it the first time without being told. But he didn't do anything extra. Didn't reach for anything that wasn't already on the map. He was hired. For 2 months, nothing happened. Jimi played the charts. He showed up early, sometimes before anyone else, and sat in the corner with his guitar across his knees, running through chord shapes so quietly that the strings barely vibrated. He smiled when spoken to and didn't speak much otherwise. The other musicians in the band liked him fine in the way you like a piece of furniture that fits exactly where it's supposed to. Ike barely noticed him. That was the goal in a way, not to be noticed, to be useful and invisible at once. Jimi understood the rules without having them explained. He'd played behind enough people by then to know how the thing worked. Some men hired musicians to support their vision, and some men hired musicians to stay out of its way. With Ike, it was the second thing. You held the wall up. You didn't try to decorate it. The rooms they played in those months were the kinds of rooms that don't get remembered. Low ceilings, sticky floors, a bar along one wall, and tables that wobbled. Crowds that came to dance and drink and forget about whatever the week had done to them. Nobody was listening too hard to any individual instrument. The music was supposed to be a current, something you moved with, not something you examined. So for 2 months, Jimi James was exactly what he was supposed to be. Then came the Tuesday night in February. It was a slow set in a slow room. Half the tables were empty. The crowd that had shown up was distracted. A fight had broken out near the bar in the first set and drained some energy from the room that never quite came back. Ike was playing through it, working the stage, but even he seemed to be going through motions. They were 3 songs into the second set when it happened. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Not even a full phrase, more like the beginning of one. Jimi's fingers moved up the neck to a place they weren't supposed to go, found a cluster of notes that bent slightly, and then resolved into something that had no business being in the song they were playing. Something from a different gravity. It was there, and then it was gone, and Jimi's hand came back down to where it was supposed to be, and the song continued. 4 seconds. Nobody in the crowd noticed. Nobody at the tables. Nobody at the bar. The music hadn't stopped. The rhythm hadn't broken. To anyone listening at the level most people in that room were listening, nothing had changed. But Ike had stopped moving at the front of the stage. Not visibly, he kept playing, kept the set going, kept his face doing what it was supposed to do. But something had shifted behind his eyes. He'd heard it. 4 seconds, and he'd heard everything inside it. Not just the notes, but the ease of them. The fact that they'd arrived with no strain, no announcement, like water finding a crack in stone. He finished the set. He didn't say anything backstage. Jimi was packing his guitar when Ike came to stand next to him. He didn't raise his voice. He never raised his voice in situations like this. It was one of the things about Ike that made people more careful around him, not less. "You know what that was?" Ike asked. Jimi looked up. "I know. Don't." That was it. 2 words. Jimi nodded once and zipped the case. The next rehearsal was the same as always. The next 2 shows were clean. Jimi held the rhythm, stayed in the channel, gave nothing away. Whatever had happened that Tuesday seemed to have folded back into him without a trace. Ike stopped thinking about it. The show was a Friday in March. A better room this time. Bigger crowd, better energy. The kind of night where the band hit something in the first song and everyone in the room felt it at once. These were the nights Ike liked, when the machine ran the way it was built to run, when the sound was tight and the crowd was moving and everything was in its right place. They were deep in the 3rd set, a slow burn of a song, the kind that built in long, shallow increments. The rhythm section laying something almost hypnotic underneath, while Ike worked a melody that circled and returned. The room had gone slightly loose around it, not restless, just softened, following the music somewhere unhurried. Jimi was at the back of the stage, and then he wasn't. What came out of his guitar in the next 20 seconds was not a solo in any ordinary sense of the word. It wasn't a statement or a showpiece or an argument for attention. It was more like something that had been sealed in a room for a long time and finally found a door. Notes that bent into shapes no one had asked them to take. Phrases that started in the song they were playing and ended somewhere else, somewhere further, somewhere the song had never been and didn't know how to follow. His right hand worked the strings with a kind of physical fluency that seemed to bypass decision. Not thinking and then playing, but playing the way breathing happens, without the gap in between. The bass player stopped. Not on purpose. He just stopped. His fingers left the strings and he stood there with his hands still and his mouth slightly open. And the sound his instrument had been making simply ceased to exist. The drummer didn't stop, but his time changed. It slowed, just barely, pulled by something he couldn't have named. Ike was at the front of the stage. He did not turn around. In the crowd, a man who had been dancing with a woman near the left speaker stepped back from her without knowing he'd done it. His arms dropped. He stared at the stage. Nobody was talking. The 20 seconds ended. Jimi came back to the rhythm. The song found its shape again. The bass player's hands returned to the strings. The room breathed. Nobody applauded. It wasn't that kind of moment. Applause would have required understanding what had happened, having a word for it, being able to place it in a category. None of that was available yet. The room just held it in the way a room holds a smell. Present, unidentifiable, not gone. Backstage, Ike was already there when Jimi came off. He looked at Jimi for a moment. Then he looked at the guitar in Jimi's hand. Then back at Jimi. "Get your things," Ike said. Jimi didn't argue. He didn't explain or apologize or ask for another chance. He picked up his case, put his guitar inside, closed the latches and left. The door shut. One of the other musicians started to say something. Ike was already walking the other way. What happened to Jimi James after that is the rest of the story. The part that filled venues and changed what a guitar was supposed to be able to do and left rooms full of musicians standing with their mouths open for years across 2 continents. It happened fast, and it happened in the way that some things happen when they've been held back long enough, all at once, without apology, in a rush that didn't stop until it was finished. He found his way to New York. He found his way to London. He became someone else's name. Ike Turner continued building his empire in the years that followed. He had real success, real hits, a sound that shaped an era. He was not a man who looked backward. He had a skill for moving forward that bordered on refusal. Refusal to examine, refusal to reckon, refusal to sit with anything too long. But the story followed him. It found him in interviews where he didn't go looking for it. It arrived in the form of a journalist question, or a musician who'd heard something from someone else, or just a silence after a name was mentioned that lasted a beat too long. In 1990, a music journalist in Los Angeles asked Ike about his years with the Kings of Rhythm, about the players who'd come through, about whether any of them had surprised him. There was a pause before he answered. Ike Turner had spent most of his adult life moving faster than regret. He was not built for the particular stillness that the question required, but he sat in it for a moment, and what came out was quieter than most things he said. I had a guitar player for a few months, he said. Young kid, didn't talk much, played rhythm mostly. Then one night he played something, I don't know what you'd call it, and I let him go. The journalist waited. That was Jimi Hendrix, Ike said, before he was Jimi Hendrix. Another pause. Firing him was probably the dumbest thing I ever did in music. He didn't say it like a confession. He said it the way a man states a fact he has already made peace with, or decided to make peace with, because the alternative is carrying something that weighs too much to carry. The journalist wrote it down. What Ike didn't say, what he'd carried without saying it for nearly 3 decades, was the thing about the 20 seconds, the way the bass player's hands had gone still, the way the room had stopped talking all at once, the way he, Ike Turner, who had spent his entire career building a machine designed to ensure that no one on his stage ever pulled a room out from under him, had stood at the front of that stage and felt exactly that happening behind him and had not turned around. He hadn't turned around because he already knew. If he turned around, he would have to see it. And if he saw it, the wall he'd spent years building, the one that said, this stage is mine, this sound is mine, this room is mine, would have a crack in it that nothing would ever fill. So he kept his face forward and the 20 seconds ended. And after the set, he said 2 words and pointed to the door. He had controlled the room. He had not controlled what happened in it. That distinction had taken 30 years to stop feeling like the same thing.